Cards on the table, my initial viewing of this video was quite possibly the angriest I had been at a video essay all year.
Have you ever met somebody who is absolutely committed to forcing their ideas down your throat? Me too. It's becoming an increasingly bad problem. The rise of the debate bro.
I find it interesting your example is Shapiro, who you felt the need to give a content warning for despite him barely being mentioned. Seriously, outside of the clip I just played, he's brought up a handful of other times in passing, given he's actually infamously difficult to get a hold of for debates. Nathan Robinson of Current Affairs once discussed an occasion where some students at the University of Michigan offered to set up a three-way debate between Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, and Bari Weiss, along with himself, Brianna Joy Gray, and Max Alvarez. None of the three that were meant to represent right-wing ideas responded to this offer. Norman Finkelstein, a very well-known critic of Israel with a Ph.D. from Princeton University and multiple books to his name, has challenged Shapiro to a debate previously on the topic of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and he has completely ignored the offer. I am also curious what you mean by forcing their ideas down your throat. Because when I imagine that, I don't picture somebody incredibly obsessed with debate. If anything, I imagine an authoritarian, somebody who does not want there to be debate around their ideas because they do not view what they're saying as debatable. Think less the person who argues with you constantly, and more the person who refuses to argue with you, who does not believe there to be a point in arguing with you because you are so self-evidently incorrect. By being willing to debate a topic, you are inherently implying it is worthy of some level of discussion, for whatever reason that may be. That's different from demanding that nobody question your beliefs and forcing said beliefs onto the entire population.
So much so that it's crossed the barrier between internet and real life and become an actual phenomena via those insufferable street interview guys.
LGBTQ rights or economic stability.
People like this have always existed, though. Back when Bill O'Reilly still had a show on Fox News, he would regularly have a man by the name of Jesse Waters, who, funnily enough, now has his own Fox News show in prime time, do exactly this. Go up to random people on the street, or enemies of Bill O'Reilly, and badger them in some way in public. One Daily Show segment from 2016 notes Waters going to Chinatown in New York to discuss politics with them, even though some of the people he was talking to couldn't speak English.
Donald Trump beating up on China at the debate. Trump has been beating up on China. How does that make you feel?
Speak! Why don't you speak?
Hey, asshole, they don't speak English. That's why they're silent. It's easy to make fun of someone when they can't respond.
Almost a full decade before that segment aired, Keith Olbermann, who did this so long ago it was back when Countdown was still on MSNBC, pointed out O'Reilly's habit of doing exactly this.
Mr. O'Reilly's reference to hunting you down and coming after you is a dead giveaway that he plans another onslaught of attacks by his stalker producers, the ones who followed Denver Post TV writer Joanne Ostro from her home to a supermarket, who dogged WashingtonPost.com blogger Bill Arkin, who tried to do the same thing to Florida Judge Manuel Lopez until Judge Lopez called the cops and they nearly arrested O'Reilly's guy. An example of the process.
Bill Arkin, how you doing? Fox News. How's it going?
Me too.
Mr. Arkin, can we talk to you about some of the comments that you made?
Can you leave me alone for just a second?
Actually, no, we'd like to talk to you for a second. How could you say what you said? I mean, don't you think that was really hurtful and harmful to the military families, to the soldiers serving in Iraq? Let's address this.
Well, let's start at the top. What is debate? Just kidding, we're not going back that far. You guys all know what debate is, but so we're all on the same page throughout this video, I'm going to give my own definition, which we'll use for the rest of it. I define debate as an exchange of ideas between two or more people.
I want everyone to take note of just how vague that definition is, because it leads to one of my biggest problems with this video. You see, later on, he says he's beginning the time period he is critiquing with the popularity of Destiny.
Tracing the history of debate, at least online, is quite difficult, so for the sake of my sanity, we're going to start with Destiny. The guy, Stephen Burnell.
Which I don't actually have too much issue with on its own, given you do need to truncate this narrative to some extent. However, you then go on to call Destiny the grandfather of online debate.
And as the grandfather of online debate.
And I start taking issue, given debate has existed on the internet since its inception. Usenet, for example, which was essentially a really early example of a forum, first launched to the general public, or at least the general public that had access to the internet, which at that point was very few people, in 1980. For reference on just how long ago that was, the event that people call the birthday of the internet, basically the thing that allowed computers on different networks to communicate with one another, did not come about until 1983. And quickly became famous for its large amount of ideas being shared, sometimes in incredibly hostile ways. In fact, it was reading conversations on Usenet which caused Mike Godwin to create his famous Godwin's Law in the early 1990s. And I also want to take a moment to note that Mike Godwin was not the first person to point out that people had a tendency of doing this, nor was Hitler the first example ever given of people saying their political opponents are exactly the same as this evil person. There was even an article in the New Republic in 1962 discussing how people had been quoting a completely made-up line from then-Soviet leader Khrushchev, which noted the following: "The Russian premier is becoming one of this country's favorite authors, and a favorite in Congress, too. It has become standard practice whenever a legislative proposal nears decision for someone to drop the ultimate weapon, the 100-megaton argument. First, a charge that the measure is socialism, and second, a quotation proving that an affirmative vote will actually be a vote for ultimate Soviet domination." The article goes on to note that the previous year something similar had happened when an American manufacturer used a completely fabricated quote of Vladimir Lenin's in its advertising campaign. And this matter is only made worse by, again, your incredibly unhelpful definition. What counts as an exchange of ideas? Because if you define that vaguely enough, then something as simple as what game you want to play can count as a debate if the other person wants to play a different game. This is a problem present throughout a large swath of the video, by the way. You see, he goes on to say that debates are impossible these days, and he much prefers regular conversation.
That being said, my love of debate has been significantly dampened over these last few years because, frankly, you can't have a good debate anymore. You can have a good conversation, but a good debate is much, much harder to come by.
However, this is based on the notion of a sort of mutual exclusivity that he cannot prove exists. What's stopping me from saying that, for example, I debated somebody during a conversation? What definition of conversation are you using, and why is debate excluded? And he said earlier that it's very difficult to have conversations if you frame them as debates.
The word debate has become so tainted that it's near impossible to have a good conversation with somebody if you frame it as a debate.
Which is even more vague than what you've already said. And he goes on like this too, essentially saying we should avoid one completely nebulously defined term in favor of a different nebulously defined term.
If I were to give advice to all those like me who enjoy hearing ideas be exchanged but can't stand the current debate landscape, I'd recommend avoiding debate online and in person, and instead just try listening to people having regular conversations. The worst vices of the debate crowd are largely not present and people just, talking.
Of course, certain groups of people make doing this ill-defined thing very, very difficult.
That is, unless, of course, you're talking to a very specific kind of person.
He tells you who that is after he plugs subscribing to his channel. I'll just give you the answer right now. He's referring to academics. I should also note this reveal is somewhat ruined by the fact that he specifically said he thought the problem was the worst among academics earlier in the video.
In my eyes, I think it's most bad in academics. Perhaps this quality is more present in academics, or perhaps I just surround myself with well-educated people, but I've found throughout my life that the academics I speak to have a knack for turning a lot of conversations into debates. Every conversation seems to turn into a battle to see who's right, and at the end, everyone is left a little angrier and sadder.
Again, I'm forced to wonder where exactly this line is. If, say, I want to go out somewhere for dinner, and a different person who's also going to dinner with me wants to go somewhere else, then we're both trying to convince the other that we're right, in the sense of we're both trying to make our case that our choice for dinner is better than the other one. Does that count as a debate? I really don't get what you mean here. I also just need a lot more context in general regarding which academics you've talked to, given academics is an incredibly broad field. I also am curious what this conversation was about, and why they were arguing with you in the first place. Were you saying something about a field they had expertise in that was incorrect? If so, then arguing with you seems like the justified reaction. Or was something else going on here? You don't explain anything.
When somebody like this is a prominent figure in your life, it can quickly drive you insane. Having to justify every dumb thing you say in the middle of conversation is no way to have fun.
Again, without a knowledge of what you're saying that caused people to react like this, I have no context for how valid of a statement this even is. For all I know, you're basically just doing the image I currently have on screen. What have you said that would lead me to believe this isn't the case? Well, the answer is nothing.
That's something I think people forget about conversation. It's supposed to be enjoyable. Debate has its place within the world, but conversation is still king.
And who the fuck are you to determine what is and isn't enjoyable? What if somebody enjoys the sort of constant argumentation you describe as a debate in the modern form in this video? I mean, there are people willing to engage in it, so it seems to me like somebody out there must gain pleasure from doing such. And if that's the case, again, who the fuck are you to determine they shouldn't feel that way? What right do you have to declare such a thing?
A conversation is a fragile thing, and it can be killed so easily by one person forcing the other to acknowledge that what they just said doesn't make any sense.
Okay, well, what if what they're saying doesn't make any sense? Fuck, what if the person fell victim to some nonsensical ideas that are objectively harmful and damaging? Are we just supposed to not tell them they don't make any sense and let them continue believing genuinely abhorrent things? What if they're at risk of putting their trust into somebody who doesn't deserve it? Or something else that could actually harm them? Should we just not tell them that doing so is nonsensical because it might kill a conversation? Which, by the way, you don't know. What if the person sees that as an opportunity to explain their views better and possibly get others on their side? I can think of 1,000,001 different nuances to your situation that you don't take into account.
The Oxford Dictionary gives a much longer definition than that, which, to be honest, I disagree with. Debate has grown since the writing of that definition.
Yeah, the world has really changed since the Oxford Dictionary was updated last month.
It no longer refers to a conversation in a legislative capacity, and more refers to just a neutral sharing of ideals.
So it's an argument or discussion expressing different opinions, to use a different definition of the word found in the Oxford Learner's Dictionary.
I mean, I can hardly call the debate over Stellar Blade a public meeting after which a vote is put forward. Let's get real, the people who care about Stellar Blade have never been in public.
Well, that's entirely dependent on location. There's no law of the universe preventing that from happening. Also, that just doesn't make sense grammatically. Obviously, the debate can't happen in a certain place, in a wider sense at least. Obviously, if we're specifically referring to one debate as the debate, it can happen in a certain location. But a debate can. What you're essentially doing is complaining about a definition not including things it isn't meant to. This is just designed to give you an understanding of what one form of the word debate means. But there are other ways to describe how that word is used in conversation. Now, this might sound like I'm agreeing with him. However, here's my problem with this part of the video. If this definition does not fit the word debate as you are using it, why even mention it in the first place? Wouldn't it make more sense to look for a definition that does agree with you as opposed to critiquing one that doesn't? Especially given, as I just established, said definitions do exist.
Debate on the internet has, since its popularization, been most often used as a form of blood sport instead of a way to share ideals.
Who's to say those are mutually exclusive? You just assert that they are without any explanation or evidence.
Let's get real though. This form of debate is most prominent in the political sphere of the internet. Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, Hank Becker, all these people have made great use of debate to bolster their audience, and all of them engage in some form of spurious argumentation to make themselves appear dominant.
So, do you have any evidence to back up your claim by any chance? Because I dislike two of those people, don't get me wrong, but I have no idea who the third one is. So, I have no understanding of if your claim is accurate or not. And I imagine there are going to be others like me, except instead of not hearing about the third person, they haven't heard of Shapiro or Steven Crowder. This is why providing proof is incredibly important.
These debaters love to engage in strong-arming and will never concede their points. For a more in-depth look at that, go watch the Alt-Right Playbook.
Who are these debaters in this context? The specific people you mentioned earlier? Or political debaters as a whole? And by the way, why would you recommend a series specifically about the alt-right if you are discussing something that appears in people across all ideologies? That's why I assume you said political debate generally. Also, is there any specific video in the 26-episode series which I should be checking out in order to see your evidence? Does every episode have proof of this? I'm very confused as to what you're sourcing here outside of something in this particular video series.
These debates aren't about ideas, they're about appearances. It's about who looks better, not whose ideas were better.
Again, that's always been a problem, though, going back to the very beginning of political dialogue in any real sense. Walter Mondale once noted that he essentially knew his 1984 presidential campaign was over after his second debate with Ronald Reagan because Reagan had made a funny quip.
Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
As the book The Clothes Have No Emperor put it while discussing this event, at the second Reagan-Mondale debate in Kansas City, the president successfully delivers an obviously rehearsed one-liner, He then quotes what I just showed Reagan saying, and thereby puts an end to fears about his recently displayed senility. So determined are voters to ignore his flaws that not even his observation that Armageddon could come the day after tomorrow, a comment that prompts Nancy to gasp, "Oh no," or his almost incoherent closing statement, something about a time capsule and a drive down the Pacific Coast Highway, can dissuade them. This was both after Reagan had dropped significantly in polls and even had his fitness for office questioned due to a bad showing in his first debate with Walter Mondale, and after Mondale had essentially sunk Gary Hart's 1984 presidential campaign during the primaries through a quip of his own that was used in both speeches criticizing Hart by Mondale and in a debate to Hart's face.
But I think there is a fundamental difference, for example, between Vice President Mondale and myself. That is, I think we can meet the basic human needs and commitments of the people of this country by restoring entrepreneurship. 90% of the new jobs in this society have come from small businesses, and I think the dedication of the Democratic Party to minority people in the South and elsewhere shouldn't just be jobs. It should be the opportunity to own and operate businesses that create jobs.
Mr. Glenn?
Can I respond to that?
Well, we'll come back to you. Let some of the others.
What's new about coming out from entrepreneurs? You know, when I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
Yeah.
To give you all an idea of how important aesthetics were to the debates by this point, both Mondale and Reagan's campaign managers later recounted to John Stossel that they spent a day debating amongst themselves how far apart Reagan and Mondale's podiums should be.
When Ronald Reagan debated Walter Mondale, Rollins and Beckel were the opposing campaign managers.
You remember the amount of time we spent debating the debate, all the logistics of it, how high the podiums were going to be,
how much
far
time?
apart. Oh, we days.
Days?
Oh yeah, we had teams negotiating.
Like how many? Time? Where they are?
Color of the room.
How high?
What difference would it make to the candidate what color the room was?
Because in certain conditions and certain colors work for certain candidates.
Because Mondale was shorter than Reagan.
We wanted more distance between the two podiums. I remember we debated between 7.5 feet and 9 feet for it seemed like a day and a half.
Now, my point is not that this is good. However, I do think framing it as something exclusive to our modern era, like you are doing, is incredibly inaccurate. This has always been a part of who humans are, and as much as we want to say it's particularly bad in this era, there's just nothing to back that up.
If you are the debate bro, I would suggest using the doorknob method of conversation.
I just want to highlight him saying there's a link to this article in the description of his video when there's not. The only thing he links is the source for a Destiny clip he plays, and aside from that, we have what I believe to be the video's tags.
The idea is that conversation is a lot like improv.
Improv?
Improv.
Improv. Improv.
Improv.
Improv.
One of the key rules of improv is not to ask questions, since it puts pressure on your partner to come up with an answer. In my eyes, conversation should flow freely like a river. When you jump in to ask somebody to back up their claim, it creates a block in the flow.
Well, who's to say that's inherently a bad thing? If somebody is making outrageous claims, then blocking the flow seems like a worthwhile method of making sure you aren't being lied to or misled in some way. Again, this is all based on your subjective view of how conversation should operate, and I'm not saying you're not allowed to have that opinion. However, you are presenting it as if it is objectively the case. And I don't mean in some bullshit, you didn't directly say your review of a video game was your opinion kind of way. I mean in a, you are making objective claims about something as fundamental to humanity as conversing with one another while using objective language. That is a massive issue. And that continues as well, with him saying that conversations can't flourish if they aren't like this.
This is the key to good conversation. It's adding doorknobs. Don't let your conversation die because you turn it into a contest over who's right and who's wrong. Let it flourish by being open and kind.
And I should note, it is very possible conversations could start flourishing after you follow these directions, especially if the other person has a tendency of leaving said conversations you're having with them if you aren't behaving in this manner like this man advises others to do.
If the conversation starts getting tense, change the subject and come back to what you were saying earlier. If things are getting really insufferable, there's no shame in saying aloud that the conversation is getting kind of serious, and above all, there is absolutely no shame in just leaving. If you're required to be there, just go pretend you're taking a piss or something, and if you're not required to be there, just go. Life's too short, man.
He then goes on to say that he is teaching us how to hold a conversation, and implies his video is similar to a guide on the topic.
Jamie, aren't you just teaching people how to hold normal conversations? Yeah, I am. No shame in that. I am quite autistic, and honestly, if somebody came up to me with a guide on how to hold good conversation, I would be very thankful for that.
He wants to make it clear that he is not condescending to his audience and fundamentally means well.
If I'm being slightly condescending, I hope you know it's not intentional. I'm coming at it from a place of meaning well.
Ignore the fact that earlier in the video he joked about a personality type he does not like being comparable to a disease. Wonder where people would get the idea he's condescending.
If you are the debate bro, I am praying for you. I hope you get better soon.
But don't worry, he eventually does conclude by admitting this is all somewhat selfish on his part, and he is simply trying to avoid people from, again, having personality types he subjectively does not like.
That being said, this video is ultimately selfish. I don't want a society of debate bros. I want one of people who know how to hold interesting and fun conversations. When I say a doorknob, I visualize a sentence that can be opened into a new conversation. Dude, did you hear that Alex got married? Oh my god, did you hear about that plane that fell from the sky recently? What were your thoughts on the final season of Game of Thrones? I try most often not to let these doorknobs be questions.
You say after giving 3 examples of doorknobs, all of which were questions. Okay, he does try to justify this a tad, but that similarly doesn't make any sense.
A question is answered by only one person, and a doorknob is a conversation for everyone. You gotta make sure you can engage too.
But that's an arbitrary distinction at best, especially given you said the problem with questions was they put pressure on people to come up with answers. But how is that not also true of these conversation starters or conversation continuers that aren't questions even though they're phrased exactly like questions? Anyway, final thoughts. This video was still quite frustrating. Good night and good luck.